Last time we spoke about the first Tianjin incident. In September of 1931, as tensions rose between China and Japan, Commander Zhang Shiliang enjoyed an opera in Beiping, unaware of the impending Mukden incident. With senior commanders absent, Japanese forces quickly gained local support. Kai-shek ordered non-resistance, fearing conflict would ruin northeast China. Meanwhile, Japanese officials plotted to install Puyi as the puppet emperor. Riots erupted in Tianjin, orchestrated by the Japanese, leaving the city in chaos as Zhang Shiliang's forces struggled to maintain order against the well-armed attackers. In a tense standoff at Haiguang Temple, the Japanese military issued an ultimatum to the Chinese security forces, citing threats to overseas Chinese. Wang Shiqiang ordered a strategic withdrawal, but the Japanese escalated with artillery fire. Despite fierce resistance, the plainclothes attackers regrouped, leading to ongoing skirmishes. Amidst the chaos, Puyi was covertly extracted by the Japanese forces, paving the way for the establishment of the puppet state of Manchuria. Ultimately, Japanese aggression continued, deepening tensions in China. This episode is the Jinzhou Operation. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. Before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible with the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I released a rather silly episode highlighting how to play the USSR in the board game Axis and Allies. Over on Echoes of War, we just released the last part in a 4-part series on who are the best and worst generals, admirals, and air commanders of World War II. Also, if you'd like to support me further, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The latest exclusive podcast is How the Sicilian Mafia Aided the Allies During World War II. Please go check it out. When the Mukden incident occurred, Zhang Shiliang was in Beiping, serving in his capacity as the commander of the North China garrison. On the night of September the 18th, he was at an opera, enjoying a performance by the famous singer Mei Langfan. His deputies were also away from Shenyang. Wan Fulin was in Beiping. Zhang Shiliang was attending his father's funeral in Jinzhou. With the absence of the senior provincial commanders during the incident, the Japanese quickly gained cooperation from the acting commanders. In Shenyang, Yu Jishan, the commander of the Eastern Borders Garrison, and in Changchun, acting provincial forces commander Xi Xia, both swiftly aligned themselves with the Japanese. Although the Northeastern Army had approximately 130,000 troops in the region, compared to the Japanese force of maybe 40 to 50,000, Kai-shek urgently issued a non-resistance order to the Northeastern troops, which Zhang Shiliang would confirm. It was actually his stance prior to September the 18th, as there had been other incidents such as the Wanbaoshan incident, whereupon Zhang Shiliang sent a secret telegram to his subordinates on July the 6th. If we go to war with Japan at this time, we will surely be defeated. If we lose, Japan will demand that we cede territory and pay compensation, and Northeast China will be ruined. We should avoid conflict as soon as possible and deal with it in the name of justice. A month after this, Chiang Kai-shek sent a telegram to Zhang Shiliang dated August 16th. No matter how the Japanese army seeks trouble in Northeast China in the future, we should not resist and avoid conflict. My brother, please do not act out of anger and disregard the country and the nation. I hope you will follow my instructions. As the tensions between China and Japan increased on September the 6th, Zhang Shiliang sent this telegram to his subordinates. It has been found that the Japanese diplomatic situation is becoming increasingly tense. We must deal with everything and strive for stability. No matter how the Japanese try to cause trouble, we must be tolerant and not resist them to avoid causing trouble. I hope you will send a secret telegram to all of your subordinates to pay close attention to this matter. Thus, the Manchurian commanders were already well versed in what their stance should be. Chiang Kai-shek's hesitation to engage in combat is quite understandable. He was concerned about factions opposing him in South China, the potential reformation of the alliance between Feng Yuxiang and Yan Xishan in North China, and the threat posed by the CCP in Jiangxi province, leaving him unable to confront another adversary. Zhang Shiliang's situation was also not as advantageous as it might seem. Although he commanded nearly 250,000 men, only about 100,000 or so were stationed in the northeast, while the remainder were in Hubei. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Zhang Shiliang most likely believed the League of Nations or the Wakatsuki government in Tokyo would restrain the occupiers eventually, so they were simply biding their time. According to Nelson Johnson, the American minister in China, Counselor Yano of the Japanese legation in Beiping had informal discussions with Zhang Shiliang, suggesting that Jinzhou would inevitably succumb to the Japanese and that, quote, "The Tokyo Foreign Office would gain prestige and be better able to shape events to China's advantage if the Chinese avoided a clash by withdrawing voluntarily." It was also implied that some of Zhang Shiliang's supporters might be reinstated in official roles within the new government in Shenyang. Johnson also added, "Zhang Shiliang is believed to have been led to his present decision by these inducements, along with the bitter hostility towards him at Nanjing and the lack of support from the quarter." In essence, Zhang Shiliang was effectively coerced into non-resistance by both sides. Certainly in December of 1931, with no hope for international intervention, and the Nanjing government in turmoil following Chiang Kai-shek's temporary resignation, Zhang Shiliang's options were severely limited. The Kwangtung Army received clear instructions not to move beyond the South Manchurian railway zone, which hindered the plans of Lieutenant Colonel Ishiwara Kanji, the architect of the Manchurian invasion, as we all know. After securing the region around the South Manchurian Railway, Ishiwara focused his attention upon Jinzhou. Following the fall of Mukden, Jinzhou became the administrative headquarters and civil government of Zhang Shiliang, making it a focal point for Chinese forces. Jinzhou is the southernmost part of Liaoning province, directly en route to Shanhaiguan, the critical pass that separates Manchuria from China proper. It was the furthest point Zhang Shiliang could establish his HQ while still being within Manchuria, and thus it became the de facto last stand, or Guanwai, outside of Shanhaiguan Pass for Zhang Shiliang's northeastern army. Japanese sources indicate that Zhang Shiliang began covertly instructing local governments in Manchuria to comply with and pay taxes to Jinzhou. He also dispatched spies to Japanese-occupied territories and was conspiring to assassinate Japanese officials who opposed Chiang Kai-shek. Obviously, Jinzhou had to be seized to control Liaoning, and thus all of Manchuria. The Japanese first tried to bully Jinzhou into submission by bombing it. On October the 8th, Ishiwara commanded 5 captured Chinese aircraft from the 10th Independent Air Squadron, flying from Mukden to conduct a raid upon Jinzhou, claiming it was merely a reconnaissance mission. They flew over Jinzhou at approximately 1:40 p.m. and dropped 75 bombs weighing about 25 kilograms each, targeting the barracks of the 20th Division, governmental buildings, and Zhang Shiliang's residence. Additionally, they took photographs of the Chinese defensive positions. The attack served 2 purposes. One was to intimidate Zhang Shiliang, and the other was to send a message to Tokyo HQ. The bombing of Jinzhou caused an uproar in Tokyo, and it shocked the League of Nations, which had previously been pretty indifferent to the entire situation. Consequently, Tokyo HQ felt compelled to retroactively approve of the Kwangtung attacks, while simultaneously demanding an end to further action. Rumors began to circulate that Ishiwara and his associate, Itagaki, aimed to establish an independent Manchuria as a base for a coup d'etat against the Japanese government, intending to initiate a Showa restoration. On October the 18th, War Minister Minamijiro sent a telegram to the Kwangtung Army ordering them to halt offensives in Manchuria, and he dispatched Colonel Imamura Hideyoshi to ensure Ishiwara and Itagaki ceased their reckless operations. However, when Hideyoshi met with the 2 men at a restaurant in Mukden, they simply dismissed him. In reality, Ishiwara and Itagaki's plans were in jeopardy, but by early November, they found a pretext for action after Ma Jiashan's forces damaged the Nanjing railway bridge. This hostility provided them with justification to invade Heilongjiang province, alongside their allies led by General Zhang Haipeng. Following the occupation of the north, a new opportunity arose in the southwest. That opportunity was the first Tientsin incident, which erupted November the 9th, initiated by our old friend Colonel Dohara Genji, with assistance from some anti-Chiang Kai-shek Chinese. A small contingent launched an attack on the Peace Preservation Corps in Tientsin. Dohara devised this plan with the intention of creating chaos to kidnap the former Manchu Emperor Puyi, allowing the Kwangtung Army to later install him as the ruler of a new Manchurian state. Although Dohara sought reinforcements from Tokyo HQ, his request was denied, prompting him to turn to the Kwangtung Army for support. They agreed to coordinate an attack on Tientsin, but insisted that a pretext must be established first. To execute this plan, they would need to capture Jinzhou initially. A second Tientsin incident occurred on November the 26th, when Chinese soldiers attacked the Japanese barracks in Tientsin at 8:20 p.m., marking another false flag operation orchestrated by Dohara. Upon hearing the news, General Honjo Shigeru chose to support the Tientsin army, which they believed was now in peril. The 4th Mixed Brigade and the 2nd Infantry Battalion of the 2nd Division, comprising about 10,000 troops, advanced with 13 armored cars stationed along the Beiping-Mukden Railway. The Kwangtung Army also requested assistance from the Korean Army, and Commander Hayashi organized a mixed brigade to cross the border. Now, of course, in order to provide assistance at Tientsin meant heading through the Shanhaiguan Pass, and this meant going through Jinzhou. Tokyo General HQ was yet again thrown into consternation by the latest aggravation of the Manchurian crisis. Incensed by the Kwangtung Army's lack of sincerity in submitting to the discipline of Tokyo, as they would put it, the force got within about 30 kilometers of Jinzhou when War Minister Minamijiro ordered them to immediately withdraw to a line east of the Liao River. Ironically, what actually made the Kwangtung Army comply was not so much Tokyo's authority, but rather the refusal or foot-dragging of the Korean Army, who had sent a message that they were unwilling to attack Jinzhou. The Kwangtung Army continued on getting into some skirmishes with Chinese defenders around the Daling River and at Takushan, as Tokyo HQ sent countless furious messages demanding they withdraw from the Jinzhou area, and by the 28th they finally did it. Facing the real possibility that the Jinzhou operation might devolve into a fiasco without reinforcements, Ishiwara relented, remarking at the time, "Tokyo has collapsed before Jinzhou." There was another factor at play as well. Some have speculated Ishiwara tossed his hand on the field initiative because he was playing for time, expecting the Japanese government to fall, and the submission of a new team at Central Army HQ to rise up, one perhaps more compliant to the aggressive Kwangtung Army stance. Now, while the Japanese forces pulled back into the South Manchurian Railway Zone, Prime Minister Wakatsuki Rejirou began negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek's Nanjing government through the League of Nations, suggesting the Jinzhou area be declared a neutral area. The Chinese initially refused, and while the Kwangtung Army declared they would not attack, they still sent aircraft to circle Jinzhou just to scare them. The Chinese, British, American, and French governments were willing to withdraw their own troops from Jinzhou to Shanhaiguan if the Manchurian incident was resolved, and Japan committed to not infringing upon the area. Consequently, Tokyo's headquarters supported this approach and instructed the Kwangtung Army to withdraw. Although Zhang Shiliang had assured that his forces would leave Jinzhou by December the 7th, this did not occur. As a result, the Japanese began discussions to establish Jinzhou as a neutral zone. The Kwangtung Army intercepted 2 Chinese telegrams indicating Zhang Shiliang was strengthening his defenses at Jinzhou, and that Nanjing was requesting he not pull his men out. The telegrams were sent to Tokyo HQ, who agreed the Chinese were acting in a treacherous manner. The Japanese ambassador then told U.S. Secretary Henry Stimson, "It would be very difficult to withhold the army from advancing again." To this, Stimson replied, "Such actions would convince the American public that Japan's excuse for incursions, namely that she was combating bandit attacks, was a ruse to destroy the last fragment of Chinese authority in Manchuria. It would be extremely difficult to ask China to withdraw her army from her own territory." And thus began the Jinzhou crisis. On that same day, the Japanese ambassador was meeting Stimson in Washington. The Nationalist Minister of Finance, T.V. Sung, sent a telegram to Zhang Shiliang advising, "Any Japanese attack on Jinzhou should be offered utmost resistance." Also, the American minister in China, Nelson Johnson, publicly expressed the view that Zhang Shiliang would resist at Jinzhou if attacked. if only to reassure the students and public in general, some of whom clamor for military action, despite the attitude of his old generals of the Fangtian clique, who desire his resignation to enable them to sell out the Japanese. It had become clear to all observers that the Japanese were intent on capturing Jinzhou, whether they were justified or not. Their tactics of intimidation became even bolder as they began dropping air torpedoes on disused sections of railway track on December the 10th, disrupting traffic along the Beiping-Shenyang rail route and hinting that the nearby populated areas might be next. Ishwara's hopes came true on December the 13th when Prime Minister Wakatsuki Rejirou resigned on December the 11th. Having failed to control the Kwangtung Army, a new cabinet was formed under Prime Minister Kai-shek, who resumed negotiations with Nanjing, but then on December the 15th, Kai-shek resigned as chairman of the Nanjing government, leading Sun Ke to lead a very weak interim government. Preoccupied with its own survival, the Nanjing government had no time to deal with the Jinzhou crisis. Meanwhile, War Minister Minami and Chief of Staff Kanaya, who had tried to moderate the Kwangtung Army's aggressive initiatives, had been replaced by Araki Sadio, a significantly more aggressive leader who happened to be the leading figure amongst the Kodaha faction. His counterpart was Prince Kanin. With these new appointments, the atmosphere in Tokyo General HQ had changed dramatically. The new team elected to change the framing of the entire situation. They were not performing offensives against Chinese forces, but rather suppressing bandits. On December the 15th, Tokyo HQ telegraphed Mukden instructing the Kwangtung Army to, quote, synchronize an assault on Jinzhou with an attack upon bandits. Tokyo HQ even agreed to send some reinforcements from Korea to Japan. The 20th IGA Division, the 38th Mixed Brigade of the 19th Division, both crossed the border from Korea, and the 8th Mixed Brigade, 10th Division, came over from Japan. With this, the Kwangtung Army had been bolstered to around 60,450 men. On December the 17th, the Japanese launched attacks on what they were referring to as soldier bandits in Fakyu and Changchushan, which was actually a precursor to their assault on Jinzhou. The following day, on December the 18th, Japanese aircraft bombed Dongyao, resulting in the deaths of 3 Chinese civilians and causing widespread panic in the city. The Japanese actions were all the more effective when concentrated with the absolute paralysis that was gripping China. Sun Ke was too preoccupied with the survival of his own government and had neither the time nor the resources to spare for Manchuria. In addition, Stimson's strong words in private to the Japanese ambassador belied the State Department's public attitude towards interference in this conflict. On December the 21st, Hok Lin-yen, the Chinese charge in Washington, met with Stanley Hornback, the chief of the Department of Far Eastern Affairs. Yen told Hornback that the Japanese attack on Jinzhou was imminent, and he asked the U.S. to protest in anticipation of it. Hornback refused, stating the State Department was, quote, already publicly on the record with regard to the matter. No other Western power was ready to advocate any strong measures against the Japanese either. On the 22nd, the Japanese HQ at Shenyang announced that they would soon begin an anti-bandit advance west of the Yao River, and they would remove any who interfered with said operation. They also added that if any Chinese forces at Jinzhou withdrew, they would be left unmolested. By December the 26th, all preparations for the assault on Jinzhou were finalized. On December the 28th, Hangzhou initiated an anti-bandit campaign west of while Hangzhou publicly claimed they were merely clearing the country of bandits. As the Japanese forces and their collaborationist allies spread across the South Manchurian railway area to eliminate remaining pockets of resistance, the 12th Division, led by Lieutenant General Jiro Tamon, advanced from Mukden towards Jinzhou, supported by numerous bomber squadrons. Japanese intelligence estimated that Zhang Shiliang had about 84,000 troops defending the city, along with 58 artillery pieces and 2 distinct defensive lines. The first defensive line, located 20 miles north of Jinzhou, consisted of trenches designed to impede the Japanese advance at the Daling River, specifically at its bridge, and along the Beiping-Mukden Railway. The second defensive line was a series of earthworks and fortifications completely surrounding Jinzhou. The temperature at this time was negative 30 degrees, and the Imperial Japanese Army troops were dressed in their white winter camouflage uniforms. IJ reconnaissance aircraft reported approximately 3,000 Hangudze were awaiting to ambush them in Pachan County. Tamon's forces quickly overcame the alleged Hangudze in a series of small skirmishes and continued their march towards Gulbangzi, about 50 kilometers north of Jinzhou. It should be noted, many question whether the Honghu were real or simply local Chinese the Japanese coerced into action to justify their advance. By December the 31st, the Japanese vanguard had reached about 15 kilometers just in front of Jinzhou, along the banks of the Daling River. Talon paused to allow the rest of the 2nd Division to catch up. Subsequently, Talon's troops began setting up an intricate system of microphones to broadcast the sounds of an impending battle to Tokyo. This tactic appeared to be an attempt to demoralize the defenders, which proved effective as Zhang Shiliang's forces began to withdraw. On December the 30th, Zhang Shiliang had issued the order to retreat from Jinzhou. 2 days later, the American minister in China, Nelson Johnson, reported the following scene. Jinzhou railway station resembles beehive, every possible car being pressed into service and loaded with troops, animals, baggage, the last inch space. The last Chinese troops departed Jinzhou at 11 a.m. on January the 1st, carrying away the final remnants of Zhang Shiliang's authority in Manchuria. The assault on Jinzhou occurred at a particularly inopportune moment for China. Chiang Kai-shek was temporarily out of office, lacking the full support of the Nanjing government and many of its generals. It is likely that Chiang Kai-shek understood that Zhang Shiliang's forces in Jinzhou would be significantly outmatched and probably would be annihilated. His priority was to prevent the situation from escalating into an official war, allowing him to strengthen China's military capabilities for a counteroffensive. Following the fall of Jinzhou, the Northern China Army retreated south of the Great Wall into Hubei province. The Japanese then occupied Shanhaiguan, securing complete control over South Manchuria. Despite the fall of Jinzhou, there was still one last holdout in Manchuria. After Ma Zhishan was driven out of Qiqihar by the Japanese, he led his troops northeast to establish a new HQ in Heilun, where he was technically still ruling over Heilongjiang province. Ma Zhishan had gained international recognition as a resistance hero following his ill-fated battle at Qiqihar. The Kwangtung Army took note of his fame and adjusted their strategies accordingly. Komai Tokusu, the head of the Kwangtung Board of Control, suggested bringing Ma Zhishan into the ranks would provide a significant propaganda advantage. To persuade him to negotiate with the Kwangtung Army, they sent a local factory owner, Han Yuzhi. On December the 7th, Colonel Itagaki Seshiro met with Ma Zhishan in Heilun. Itagaki expressed that the Japanese aimed for 2 objectives: peace in East Asia and full cooperation between the Chinese and Japanese. He also mentioned that the officers within the Kwangtung Army were impressed by Ma Zhishan's remarkable bravery, and they were willing to grant him military command over Heilongjiang, provided they reach an agreement. In response, Ma Zhishan stated that his forces had acted solely in self-defense and that he was bound by orders from the Nanjing government. Itagaki then suggested Ma Zhishan might be appointed military commander of the province under the provincial governor in Qiqihar, Zhang Qinghui. To this, Ma Zhishan replied, "As Heilun is not very far from Harbin, he could consult with General Zhang Qinghui over the telephone or pay a call on the later in person, and that a second trip to Heilun by the Japanese representative would not be necessary." Despite Ma Zhishan's position, Itagaki felt satisfied with their meeting, believing that Ma Zhishan might align with them. However, he was constrained by anti-Japanese colleagues like the Chief of Staff, Xie Ke, and the battalion commander, Dong Fengjia. The situation shifted significantly for Ma Zhishan when Zhang Shiliang withdrew his forces from Jinzhou. On December the 7th, Itagaki and Ma Zhishan met once more, during which Ma Zhishan expressed his desire to serve as both the military leader and governor of Heilongjiang province. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, Ma Zhishan was secretly in discussions with another resistance leader, however, General Ding Zhao. When Ma Zhishan initiated his resistance against the Japanese, Ding Zhao decided to take similar action in the northern city of Harbin. Harbin serves as the gateway to northeast China, and it's its political and economic cultural hub of northern Manchuria. It functions not only as a center of the Sino-Soviet co-managed East Railway, but also as an international marketplace where Chinese and foreigners coexist. The city houses the special administrative region of the 3 eastern provinces, with Dali under the region and Daowei belonging to Jilin province. Following the Mukden incident, the Japanese army considered attacking Harbin. However, concerns about potential Soviet interference led to the plan being halted by Army Minister Minamijiro. Harbin had largely remained peaceful, and the Japanese maintained control by appointing their puppet, General Shi Jia, as governor of Jilin Province. Together with Liu Du, Xing Zhangqing, Zhao Yi, and Feng Zhanghai, Ding Chao formed the Jilin Self-Defense Army to thwart the takeover of Harbin and Jilin Province. Shan supported Ding Chao, and both generals kept in touch with Zhang Shiliang and Chiang Kai-shek, who could only offer limited support. In November of that same year, the Jilin Provincial Anti-Japanese Government, chaired by Cheng Yun, was established in Bin County. Feng Zhanghai, the head of the Guard Regiment of the Northeastern Frontier Defense Army and Deputy Commander-in-Chief Office in Jilin, refused to surrender to the Japanese forces. He rallied over 3,000 members of his regiment to resist the Japanese and rebel forces. They marched from Yongji County in Jilin Province to Shulan County, where they were joined by forces of the National Salvation Armies led by Gong Changhai and Yao Bingchuan, who were based on the Green Forest Armed Groups to create the Jilin Anti-Japanese National Salvation Army, as the Chinese love to make elaborate and long names for their organizations. On November the 12th, the Jilin Provincial Provisional Government was established in Bin County. Feng Zhanghai was appointed as the garrison commander and the commander of the 1st Brigade. The units led by Gong and Yao were reorganized into cavalry brigades under Feng's command. This series of anti-Japanese actions significantly boosted the fighting spirit of the people of Jilin and Heilongjiang Province. To launch an attack on Harbin, the Japanese Kwangtung Army first needed to punish the anti-Japanese armed forces. To eliminate Feng's anti-Japanese forces, the Japanese puppet authorities dispatched Yu Shiqiang, the commander of the Jilin Bandit Suppression Unit, to lead the puppet army in an offensive aimed at seizing Harbin as a base of control over Jilin and Heilongjiang provinces. Feng Zhanghai's troops strategically abandoned Shulan City to lure the enemy deeper into the area. The puppet army fell into the trap, and they launched a major assault on Yao Bingchuan's brigade stationed in Shuikuilu, which fiercely resisted the attack. On that same day, Gong Changhai's brigade maneuvered around the rear of the puppet army for a surprise attack, while Yao's brigade counterattacked from the front. The puppet army's Mao Shilin brigade retreated, unable to be halted by the Japanese supervisory team. At that point, Feng Zhanghai had led another brigade into the fray, pursuing Mao Shilin's brigade, and after a series of over 7 hours of intense fighting, Shulan was retaken. Within this battle, the garrison inflicted nearly 1,000 casualties on the Japanese and puppet troops, capturing hundreds, and this saw many puppet soldiers defect. The battles of Shoukou and Shulan were thus victorious. On the 16th, Yu Shiqiang's puppet forces were defeated by the 25th Brigade of the Northeast Army in Yushu. Due to the precarious situation in Shulan, Feng Zhanghai had no choice but to abandon Shulan City and to retreat his troops north of Wuchang. By the 19th, seeking urgently needed funds for his troops, Feng Zhanghai led a battalion from Achang to Lalinkang, where they were surrounded by a significant number of Japanese and puppet troops. The following day, with the help of reinforcements, they managed to repel the Japanese and puppet forces. However, the troops suffered over 200 casualties, and they were compelled to leave Lalinkang and return to Achang. By the 25th, Feng and Li moved their forces to the eastern suburbs of Harbin, with the 22nd, 26th, and 28th Brigades announcing their support in secession. On the morning of the 26th, Feng and Li entered the city from 4 directions, forcibly disarming 5 police brigades and seizing more than 3,000 firearms, along with a number of heavy weapons. They stationed the 26th and 28th Brigades and 1 regiment in the Shanghao area, while Feng Zhanghai's 4 brigades and 2 detachments were positioned in Shaokuishu and Nangang areas. The 22nd Brigade was assigned to Shangchongbao, preparing to defend against a Japanese assault. Meanwhile, the Japanese were still trying to win over Shan. This prompted our old friend Tohara to ask Shi Jia to advance his new Jinan army to Harbin and then to Hailun. However, in their way was the Jinan Self-Defense Forces of General Ding Chao and General Li Du, who had deployed their forces between Shi Jia and Harbin. On the 24th, representatives from Li Du and Ding Chao participated in a meeting with Shan's officers, convincing them to attempt to retake Qiqihar and to defend Harbin for the resistance. When Shi Jia's new Jilin army finally advanced to Shangcheng on the 25th, Zhang Shiliang instructed Shan and Ding Chao to abandon negotiations and begin fighting on the morning of the 26th. Kenji Tohara ultimately failed to intimidate the Chinese any further, as his ally Shi Jia's troops encountered stiff resistance from Ding Chao's troops. Later that afternoon, Japanese aircraft dropped leaflets over Harbin, openly demanding that the anti-Japanese forces withdraw from the city immediately. The Japanese consulate in Harbin also issued a notice to various foreign consulates stating that the Japanese army would enter Harbin at 3 p.m. on the 28th. As the new Jilin army advanced towards Chiang, this signaled to the Chinese resistance fighters that an attack was imminent. Zhang Shiliang instructed Generals Ma Zhishan and Ding Chao to halt negotiations and prepare to make a stand. By late January, the Jinan Self-Defense Corps had grown to 30,000 members, organized into 6 brigades. Ding Chao fortified defensive positions between Generals Xiqia's advancing troops and Harbin. Xiqia was caught off guard by the well-organized resistance forces, resulting in heavy losses for his army, which was unable to break through initially. In desperation, Xiqia sought assistance from the Kwangtung army, but they needed a justification for such an intervention. Once again, Colonel Dohara Kenji orchestrated a false flag operation. He incited a riot in Harbin that resulted in the deaths of 1 Japanese individual and 3 Koreans. Using the pretext that Japanese citizens were in danger, the 2nd Division under Lieutenant General Jiro Tamon began its advance towards Harbin from Jinzhou on the 28th. However, severe winter weather delayed their transportation. To complicate matters further, the Soviets denied Japanese train access to Harbin via their section of the Chinese Eastern Railway, citing a breach of neutrality. The entire Manchurian incident had escalated tensions between the USSR and Japan. When the Kwangtung Army invaded Heilongjiang province, there was genuine concerns about potential Soviet intervention, especially with their presence in Harbin. However, at the very last moment, the Soviets suddenly agreed to allow the transit on January 30th. Back on the 26th, Feng Zhanghai and Li Tu, the commanders of the Jilin garrisons, entered Harbin. And early on the 27th, Yu Shicheng, the commander of the puppet Jilin bandit suppression unit, ordered 2 brigades to attack Shanghao, Shangshu, and the Nangang areas. Japanese aircraft bombed the Shangshu and Nangang regions. The 2 brigades tasked with defending the areas valiantly fought back, resulting in quite an intense little battle. Soon thereafter, Feng Zhanghai and his reserve team joined the fray, launching a political offensive alongside their fierce attacks. The puppet army struggled to hold ground and retreated to Lalinkang. The defending troops in Shanghao fought tenaciously, inflicting heavy casualties on both the Japanese and puppet forces, shooting down a single plane and attempting to persuade a puppet army commander named Jiang Dushang to lead a revolt. By the evening, the puppet army had been driven fully back. By the morning of the 28th, the anti-Japanese forces advanced to the Zhulu Temple and Confucian Temple, capturing advantageous positions near Xinfacuan with artillery support. The cavalry brigade flanked the puppet army and launched a vigorous assault, leading to the collapse and retreat of the puppet forces towards Chiang. Gong Changhai led the cavalry in pursuit for 15 kilometers, capturing a significant number of puppet troops. After 2 days of fierce fighting on the 27th and 28th, the initial invasion of Harbin by Japanese and puppet troops was successfully repelled. Due to the defeat of Yu Shicheng and other puppet forces, the Kwangtung Army launched a direct assault upon Harbin on the morning of the 28th under the pretext of protecting overseas Chinese. They ordered Hasebe, the commander of the 3rd Brigade of the Kwangtung Army, to lead the 4th Regiment, an artillery battalion and 2 tanks on a train from Changchun to Harbin for combat. On the 29th, another combat order was issued. The 2nd Division was to assemble in Changchun and then to be transported to Harbin by truck. Part of the 4th Mixed Brigade was also moved from Qiqihar to Anda and Jiaodong by truck to support the 2nd Division from the north of Harbin. The 1st, 3rd, 8th, and 9th Squadrons of the Kwangtung Army flying team were also tasked with covering the assembly, advance, and to attack in support of the 2nd Division. Hasebe's 4th Regiment departed from Changchun by train, but due to extensive damage to the railway caused by the Northeastern Army, and furthermore, an attack by the Northeastern Army at dawn on the 29th, as they were reaching the Laoshangguo area, over on the south bank of the Shanghua River, greatly delayed them. The Japanese forces quickly shifted to an offensive strategy, however. Despite ongoing resistance, they managed to reach Shutu Chongzu village north of the Sangcha River that very night. On the night of January the 29th, Zhao Yi's brigade received word of a Japanese assault on Harbin and immediately prepared for battle. At dawn on the 30th, Brigade Commander Zhao Yi led 6 battalions in a light advance, launching a surprise attack around Shilipu, where they decisively defeated the puppet army of Liu Baolin, capturing over 700 soldiers and seizing more than 600 weapons. They then advanced to Shangchangbao to prepare for the annihilation of the Japanese forces. At around 8 p.m., the 3rd Brigade of the Japanese Army, along with the Shanggu Detachment and 2 military vehicles, arrived at Shangchang Station, intending to camp there and then to attack Harbin the following day. Zhao Yi's troops sent an ambush in the area. As the Japanese forces disembarked and assembled to plan their attack upon Harbin, the ambushing troops took advantage of their unpreparedness, launching a surprise attack from 3 sides. They unleashed heavy firepower, forcing the enemy back onto the platform before engaging in close combat with bayonets and grenades. The Japanese were caught completely off guard and they suffered significant casualties. The next day, the Japanese dispatched reinforcements from Changchun, supported by aircraft, artillery, and tanks to assault Shangchangbao. Zhao Yi found himself trapped in the isolated city, suffering over 600 casualties, including the regimental commander, and he was ultimately forced to abandon Shangchangbao, and he had to retreat to Harbin. With Shangchangbao captured, Harbin was left very vulnerable. The Self-Defense Army stationed the majority of its troops in the southern, southeastern, and southwestern regions of Harbin, including Gushang-Yutun, Bingyuan Street, Old Harbin City, and Lalatun. On that same day, several commanders convened. Li Du, the garrison commander of Yulan and the leader of the 24th Brigade, Fang Zhanghai, the commander of the Jilin Provincial Security Army, Xing Zhangqing, commander of the 26th Brigade, Yao Yi, commander of the 22nd Brigade, Ding Chao, acting commander of the Railway Protection Army and the leader of the 28th Brigade, and Wang Jiyu, director of the Jilin Police Department. They all agreed to establish the Jilin Provincial Self-Defense Army, appointing Li Du as commander, Fang Zhanghai as deputy commander, and Wang Jiyu as the commander-in-chief of the front line. They decided to utilize the 22nd, 24th, 26th, and 20th Brigades for the defense of Harbin, while Fang Zhanghai would lead the 1st Brigade and other units in a flanking maneuver against Jilin and Changchun to thwart the Japanese advance. On February the 3rd, various units of the Japanese 2nd Division arrived in the Weitonggu River area. Under the command of Doman, the division initiated an assault on the Self-Defense Army's outpost located just outside of Harbin. The 3rd Infantry Brigade of the 2nd Division, alongside Yu Shicheng, the commander of the pseudo-Chilean bandit suppression forces, led an attack with 5 brigades as the right flank against the Chinese defenders in the Xinjiang, Nangang, and Shaohong regions. Meanwhile, the 15th Infantry Brigade of the Japanese Army formed the left flank, targeting Gushangchun via Balibao along the Shanghao River. Following the conflict, all outposts of the Self-Defense Army were lost, forcing them to retreat to their primary positions. On the morning of February the 4th, the Japanese forces launched a full-scale attack, engaging the Self-Defense Army in battle. By the afternoon, the Japanese had positioned themselves on both sides of the railway, south of Gushang, Yutuan, Yangfatuan, and Yangmaojia. The 3rd Brigade was stationed east of the railway, while the 15th Brigade took position to the west. After a preparatory artillery barrage, the Japanese forces commenced their assault. The Jinan Self-Defense Army defended tenaciously, utilizing fortifications and village structures, and they concentrated their artillery fire upon the advancing enemy, inflicting significant casualties. Despite their efforts, the Japanese attack was initially repelled, prompting them to adopt a defensive stance. By about 4 p.m., the area from Yangmaojia and Yangfatuan had fallen to the Japanese, however. The Self-Defense Army continued to resist fiercely, but the Japanese intensified their assaults. The left flank launched a vigorous attack on Gushangtuan. The 28th Brigade of the Self-Defense Army, defending this area, utilized civilian structures and walls for their defense. However, Brigade Commander Wang Ruhai fled under pressure, leading to a loss of command and forcing the troops to abandon their positions as they retreated into the inner city. Simultaneously, the Japanese right flank aggressively targeted the defense of the 26th Brigade of the Self-Defense Army. Despite the desperate efforts of the brigade commander Xing Jiaqing and his troops, they were ultimately compelled to retreat to the river dam at Shiliudao Street due to their inferior equipment. Around this time, the western and southern defense lines under Wang Jingyu's command began to fall one after another. Within this critical situation, the commander-in-chief, Li Du, personally went to the front lines to organize the troops and establish a 3rd defensive line on the city's edge. They fought until nightfall, successfully halting the Japanese advance. At dawn on February the 5th, the Self-Defense Army initiated a counteroffensive. The artillery first conducted a preparatory fire, targeting the positions of the Japanese 3rd Brigade, located east of the railway. Following this, the infantry launched their attack. The Japanese troops on the front lines found themselves in a very precarious situation. In response, Jiro Taman, the commander of the 2nd Division, urgently ordered artillery to intercept the Self-Defense Army's counterattack and deployed the tank and reserve units to assist. 4 squadrons from the Air Force took off from temporary forward airfields based out of Chiang, alternating between bombing and strafing to support the ground troops. The battle was very intense, resulting in heavy casualties for both sides. However, lacking air support and facing significant threats from Japanese aircraft, the Self-Defense Army retreated to an area east of Harbin by the afternoon of the 5th. The Japanese forces then entered Harbin, leading to an immediate capture. On the 6th, the remaining self-defense forces learned of Harbin's fall and decided to abandon their original plan for a surprise attack against the Japanese army. Instead, they returned to Bianxian and Fangjiang. During this retreat, they gathered some stragglers who had fled Harbin, and they proceeded to Fangjiang County to regroup at Lidu. General Ding Chao's forces were compelled to retreat northeast along the Sungari River, while Japanese aircraft attacked them from above. After a grueling 17-hour battle, Ding Chao's army ultimately faced utter defeat. Following this loss, Majeshan made the decision to finally defect. On February the 16th, General Honjo held a conference for the Northeast Political Affairs Committee in Mukden, attended by senior Chinese officials of the new regime. This would include Zhang Jinghui, Majeshan, Zhang Shiliang, Xi Jia, and many others. The conference aimed to assign delegates in roles for the soon-to-be-established Manchukuo. On February the 14th, Majeshan was appointed governor of Heilongjiang province, and he received gold worth $1 million. February the 27th, Ding Chao proposed a ceasefire, marking the official end of Chinese resistance within Manchuria. And on March the 1st, Puyi would be installed as the ruler of the new Manchurian state of Manchukuo. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I released a rather comical episode in the form of a minor podcast, I guess you could say. It was actually just me and my friend, kind of drunk, talking about why the Axis sucked during World War II. That same episode can be found on Echoes of War. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. With the fall of Jinzhou, Zhang Shiliang had effectively been kicked out of Manchuria. With the loss of Harbin came the loss of any significant resistance to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Japan had finally conquered the northeast, and now would enthrone the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, Puyi, forming the puppet state of Manchukuo.